Females and males have different interests. Females are typically the limiting resource to males, and females then get to be choosy. But how is this choosiness expressed? How can they exert this choice on males? Well, let's look at this from a couple different perspectives. First of all, I'm going to tell you about some direct benefits. Direct benefits are when the individual female making that choice gets something from exerting that choice. Here's one example, a thing called nuptial gifts. Now, nuptials are the process of individuals marrying, and so this term comes from back in the day when people were not okay with two insects reproducing without them being married. So they call this a nuptial gift. In a nuptial gift, a male gives something to the female, and that gift allows him to reproduce with her. This insect that exhibits this nuptial gift process is known as a hanging fly. There's lots of these different kinds of things all over the world. We even have them here too. These are predaceous flies. They are not mosquitoes. They will not bite you. You have no reason to kill them. What happens is the male goes out and captures an insect and feeds it to the female. In this line drawing over here, you can see that a female is chewing on a fly that this male has captured. He's captured it, he's taken it over to her, she's just hanging out on this branch, and he gives her this fly. As she is preoccupied eating this fly, the male gets to copulate with her. The longer the female is occupied by eating that prey item, the longer the male can copulate with her. The longer he copulates with her, the more sperm get transferred. In other words, the greater his fitness. So if he's a really good hunter and gives her a really good nuptial gift, he gets to reproduce a lot. Up to a limit, there's kind of a plateau here where a larger and larger prey item doesn't necessarily mean greater sperm transfer, doesn't necessarily mean greater fitness. So females can gain access to more resources directly by this process of transfer of nuptial gifts. There's another way that females can get direct benefits, in other words, more access to energy, and that is by choosing males that have good habitats. Can you think of an example? Sure, go back to those Galapagos marine iguanas. What happens if the male gets access to really good habitat? Well, he shares that with a whole bunch of females, and those females then are going to end up mating with him. The females get a benefit of really good habitat. The males get a benefit of getting access to those females. Remember that another really big cost that females face is in being the prime givers of parental care. Well, what if a female could choose a male that was very good at taking care of the offspring? In that case, she's not going to be as under a great predation risk, and she gets to go out and feed herself. Well, this does happen in some species. Here's a male cotton-top tamarin with his two twins on his back. There are some species where males are actually pretty good parents. This is a male American burying beetle. Females will mate more often with males who are better able to provision their offspring. Burying beetles do that by going out and grabbing big carcasses of insects or mice, small mammals, and burying them along with their offspring, which are known as maggots. So those are all ways that females can benefit directly by getting more energy, by getting more food, by getting good habitat. What are ways that females can benefit indirectly? Indirect benefits are things that are given to the offspring of that female who has exerted that choice. Now, the offspring benefit typically by getting better genes. How can females judge the genes or the genetic quality of a potential male? Well, there are a few different ways of trying to go about doing this. They involve judging the male's developmental stability, judging the males based on his current health rate or parasite load, and then a third method that has been proposed known as the handicap principle. I'm going to go through all three of these in the next several slides. It used to be that when I put this slide presentation together that this was the hot couple that everyone was talking about. And so I would put this question up on the board and I would say, do you think these people have good genes? And people would generally say, yeah. And then I would ask them, how do you know? And they would say, well, I guess I don't know. I don't know if you guys even know who these people are. So let's go to somebody who's a little bit younger. I barely know these guys, but I do know that that's Deadpool. So that guy's cool. Now, do you think they have good genes? They're certainly both good looking people. I don't know whether they've got good genes or not. If I can't tell with people, are there any other animals that can tell? Well, it turns out that there's some evidence that these barn swallows might actually be good at telling whether the males have good genes or not. And in order to sort out that idea of good genes, we have to talk about developmental asymmetries. The idea is that as a zygote is being nurtured, either inside the mother or developing inside of an egg, there are all sorts of environmental pressures that embryo is challenged by. If the environmental pressures are particularly strong and the genes of that individual are not very good, then they're going to come out being very asymmetrical. Asymmetrical means not very symmetrical. So imagine that this barn swallow on the right here has really good genes, and look, he came out very symmetrical. Or maybe he was nurtured in an environment that was perfect, it was optimal. Here we have an individual that who knows what kinds of selective pressures or environmental pressures he was raised under, but genetically he did not deal with it very well. He came out very asymmetrical. In other words, he is less symmetrical than this guy over here. Now we have a female. Which one is she going to choose? Well, this happens in humans too. If we look at humans, some people are judged to be more attractive than others because their faces are more symmetrical than others. Here we have Ryan Gosling on the top, 3 different photos. One of them is his real face, one of them is one half of his face copied and then put as a mirror image on the other side. I hate this guy. Look at how symmetrical his face is. Even if you add one side of his face to the other side, it's hard to tell. Meanwhile, there's poor Matt Damon down below. His real face is in the middle, and he is incredibly asymmetrical. It's up to you to decide which one is more attractive, but there is a thought that greater symmetry in people's faces leads us to believe that they are more attractive. How about with barn swallows? There's a lot shown in this image right here, but I'm just going to focus on 1 or 2 things in this figure. First of all, we have a couple controls. We'll ignore those. We're going to ignore the difference between shorten and elongate, other than to say basically what they were able to do experimentally is cut off the tail feathers and either make them shorter or add basically like hair extensions to make these tail forks longer. So let's just look at the elongate treatment. In the red shaded box here, they have increased the asymmetry, which means that one side of the tail is really short and one side of the tail is really long. So they have increased the asymmetry. In this middle box, they have both elongated the tail and left the asymmetry similar. So they probably added some little feather extensions but kept the level of symmetry the same. And for these individuals in the treatment, they have reduced asymmetry. In other words, they've both lengthened the tails and made them very, very symmetrical. And then they asked in this study how many of these males had, or how many offspring did each of these males have. And it turns out that if you increase the asymmetry, make their tails very asymmetrical, that these males had fewer offspring that they sired than individuals who had very symmetrical tails. If you just sort of leave the symmetry alone, that's kind of the intermediate outcome. So who does the best in terms of access to females? The males who are perfectly symmetrical. That's who the females choose. Let's go back to our hot couple. How about you rate their attractiveness? They're super hot, they're okay, meh, or they're not very attractive. Now, when I show this in class, typically people say, yeah, A or B, they're pretty hot, or yeah, they're okay. Think about what your answer is here. Okay, now I want you to answer this question again. Does this change your answer at all? Just looking at this picture and thinking about parasites, probably makes you think, oh, they're a little less attractive than they were before, right? In thinking about their level of parasites, what I certainly don't want to do is have offspring that are going to have a lot of parasites. I also don't want to reproduce with somebody who's going to have genes that mean that they're going to be susceptible to parasites. Is there any way that we can tell whether somebody has parasites or not? I'll come back to that question in a little bit. Can animals tell that they potentially got parasites? Well, here's the idea. Sometimes birds can do that just based on the coloration of their beaks. Have a look at this bird. The one on the left is in a normal condition. It's got kind of an orangish shade to its beak. Even the eye ring around its eye is kind of more orangish. That's because of these compounds known as carotenoids. Think of carrots. Carrots are orange, they have lots of carotenoids. This is a limited compound in the world and it's difficult to get access to. Typically, individuals that have more of this compound have fewer parasites. That's the idea anyway. Now look at this individual on the right. Turns out it's the same individual. That individual was infused with a parasite, and that parasite has led it to have fewer carotenoids in the beak, thus potentially sending the signal, hey, that individual's got parasites. It's loaded up with them. Does that mean anything for reproductive ability? Well, in a separate study where they were able to control the carotenoid level, the color of those beaks, by feeding them different kinds of food, they were able to examine whether that influence affected the choosiness of females. So they gave a pair of brothers, a pair of male birds who were related to each other by being brothers. They gave them two different kinds of diets. These black circles indicate where males were given a diet that had rich levels of carotenoids. The open circles were brothers that had a low carotenoid diet. And over time, after about 8 weeks or a couple months, you could see that the color ranking of these guys increased. They were more orange, and you can see the orange in the beak and sometimes in the feet as well. So the males looked more orange because they had a high carotenoid diet, whereas these males looked a little less orange because they had a low carotenoid diet. And then what they did for each of these pairs of brothers, this dyad, we've got one brother who's enriched and one brother who is sort of depleted, they offered them to a bunch of different females. And they asked the females essentially, which one do you think is more attractive? And in 9 out of 10 of these cases, pretty much every time, it's the male that has the richer carotenoid diet. In other words, has an oranger beak and oranger feet. That's the one that's chosen by all these females. This guy had something else that was particularly attractive about him, apparently, that females really exerted a lot of preference for him. But for the most part, females chose the males that were richer in color, thus potentially indicating that they had a lower parasite load. Given that these were brothers, this was probably not anything due to any underlying genetic differences. Can people do that? Can people tell whether someone's got parasites? Well, if we look very carefully at these two images, where everything else is kind of fuzzed out and all we're really looking at is the essential features of this person's face, it turns out that on average, people can identify people who are sick. And the facial cues that were better able to allow us to differentiate between a sick person and a healthy person were the paleness of their skin and the relative comparison of their eyelids. The currency of sexual selection involves both direct benefits, gaining of energy for females, access to good habitat, having a male who will help out more around the house or around the nest, and indirect benefits, a way of assessing the good genes or the relative health of that potential mate. The one that I haven't talked about yet is something called the handicap principle. I'll introduce that in a second, and then in another video I'll go into a little bit more depth of the handicap principle. Real briefly, the handicap principle idea is this. If you've got this enormous tail, if you've got this enormous handicap, there must be something particularly awesome about you that will allow you to survive even though predators are going to attack you, even though there's diseases out there, even though whatever. If the environment is going to select against certain traits, if you've still got that trait and you're still alive, You must have some great genes to compensate for that. So let's sum up. Why is there sexual dimorphism? Why do males look different than females? Why do they have different behaviors? Well, sexes ultimately have different perspectives in this interaction of reproduction. They increase their fitness in different ways and by access to different things. Males, the pressure is to increase access to females. And so what that means is males will often be more aggressive, will fight more, will have different traits that allow them greater access to females. Females have a different perspective. The pressure, the selective pressure on them, is to increase energy and reduce their costs. And as a limiting resource, they get to be choosy. So they get to exert pressure on males through choice based on direct and indirect benefits. We've covered some of these indirect and direct benefits, and like I said in the following video, we'll talk a little bit more about this last indirect benefit known as the handicap principle. This doesn't answer all the questions about differences between males and females, but at least it opens up this field of study for you as another alternative to natural and artificial selection.